Welcome, everyone, back to the Irish Breakdown Podcast. Of course, it is Navy Week. We're only a couple days away from Notre Dame officially kicking off their 2023 season in Dublin, Ireland against the Navy midshipmen. And you know that you guys have been hearing us talk in nauseum this week about the challenges that the Navy triple option can have and what are the disciplinary side of defensive football in order to counteract a very unique offense. I mean, there's a reason that outside of the military academies and some Kennesaw states down in the FCS, not a lot of people in the college ranks that run the triple option because it obviously brings some unique trials and tribulations to the table. And instead of hearing me and Brian talk all week about how to stop the triple option, I figured who better to talk to than Mr. Greer Martini, former Notre Dame linebacker, who, for people that have been following Notre Dame over the last few years, if you ask me who was the absolute best at defending the triple option, it was probably this guy right here, man. Even early on in his career, he found a niche very early. Obviously ended up being a four-year letterman for Notre Dame, 191 career tackles, 14 and a half tackles for loss, interception, and a couple forced fumbles in his career with the Irish. And now I'm excited to talk about this in the second half of this. He's in the coaching side of things at the University of Charlotte as the linebackers coach as well. Greer, coach, I really appreciate you again, man, taking a little bit of time today. Navy week, it's got to be a little bit of I don't know if there's like weird emotions with this one because obviously you're a Notre Dame guy, but now you're preparing for your own season. But thank you so much for joining the podcast, man. How's everything been going?
Yeah, of course, Ryan. Thanks for having me. Things have been going well. We're obviously in fall camp as well, but excited. We don't have a week 0 game, so I get to put on the Irish this weekend and watch them, get the W in Ireland now.
Yeah, no, man, it's going to be a lot of fun. We were talking about that on the podcast yesterday. It was like, some people aren't going to get super excited from a national media perspective with Notre Dame playing Navy, but it's a week 0 game, so all eyes are going to be on Notre Dame, and we know that college football fans will be tuning in on 2:30 on Saturday. So, Greer, to start this conversation out, obviously I want to highlight what you were able to do against the triple option, talk a little bit about how to counteract it, what the challenges are, all that great stuff. And then the second half, I definitely want to get into just kind of what you've been doing since your Notre Dame career ended. So I want to ask you to start us out here because I think it's incredibly unique. There's not many, obviously as a Notre Dame player, you're going to see this offense one time a year, every single year against Navy. And then that's it. So I want to kind of hear about what your mindset is coming in and playing a team that offensively you're only going to see once a year, right? I mean, because you're going to see, like this year for Notre Dame, it's like last year with playing USC and North Carolina, like there's a lot of principles that are similar in those offenses. Navy, it's a very unique game. So as a player, kind of circling back to your career, what was it like knowing Navy's on the schedule and having to play against an offense that uniquely you're only going to see one time a year?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely unique in that fact, right? It takes a different mindset, right? The perspective that you go into that game is that it's a gritty game now, right? At the end of the day, you're going to come out of that banged bruised. But for me personally, that was always a game where they said, hey, Greer, you're up, right? Like I wasn't always a starter. I wasn't always the guy at Notre Dame. But I knew when Navy was on that schedule or any triple option teams that was going to be my calling card, right? So I was actually excited for it, which is a unique perspective because so many guys, don't really love playing the triple option. But I knew that was going to be my opportunity. And so I embraced it fully, right? And at the end of the day, I just felt like it was a game that was suited for me. One being that there wasn't any pass, right? I wasn't a great coverage guy. And so then I knew it was, 90% of the time was going to be run. And so it was just flowing to the ball. At the end of the day, I think that, like you say, right, it takes, you have to have clean eyes, a lot of discipline, dive to pitch to quarterback, whatever it may be within the front structure, within the scheme. But at the end of the day, ball is king. And I tell my linebackers now, and that from a linebacker perspective, it was that even though I knew I had to be responsibly sound within my responsibilities, I also had to find that ball every single play. And so much of it is like everyone thinks it's downhill, right? It's super physical downhill, but it's more of a lateral game. It's more of scraping over tackles, reading cloudy clear, right? And for me, it was always about finding that open space. Right. If that fullback was running down in the A gap and it was cloudy, it was a pile of bodies, I was going to scrape to that C gap, right? Because that quarterback probably pulled it. And so there's a lot of anticipation with the game. And so I think it was also just training my eyes. Okay, hey, is this an open space or do I got to scrape to the next open space and then find the ball eventually?
Yeah, it's a great note because I also played linebacker. So I've talked a lot about, the cloudy versus clear and trying to get your eyes to the right spot. Question for you though, as far as, because one thing that people harp on a lot with the triple option is that it's assignment sound, assignment correct. So like when I was in high school, we used to play a lot of triple option teams. So I remember like as an inside linebacker, it was like, you got dive, you got dive, you got dive. And then it's like the defensive end or the end man on the line of scrimmage, like you have quarterback, and then here comes the pitch man, right? Here comes the alley guy that's a quarterback to pitch type of defender. For for an offense that you have to remain very disciplined and assignment sound, but also balancing what you just said as far as at the end of the day, though, you need to find the ball, right? Like you need to get to the ball. How do you balance those two things, Greer, as a linebacker, having to understand I need to be assignment sound, but I also need to play ball and I need to get to the football at the end of the day?
Yeah, for me, it was so much like it was inside out progression, right? So like as soon as I had my primary key, right? So if I was the fullback player, once I checked that fullback and he didn't have the ball, now it was going to the next thing, right? At the end of the day, all you really need to do is obviously have assignment sound, right? Because they can expose you if there's not a guy on the pitch, right? It's going to go for a long ways. And so at the end of the day, you do have to be assignment sound, but also swarming the ball is what really defeats a Navy team, right? If you get a lot of hats to the ball, then at the end of the day, even if someone messes up assignment, someone screws up, right? That if you're flowing in the ball and you get hats, all 11 hats to that ball, I think it makes it really difficult for a team like that.
So a lot of people, I think there's a misnomer because the big plays usually that typically happen for Navy is the once in a blue moon where that pitch does get outside, right? And they have that kind of that clear path down the sideline. But working inside out, I think, is a great note because, I mean, their offense runs through that fullback. Like they want to get that dive going and then the quarterback working off of that. Knowing that that is the progression as far as playing inside and out, as you said, how, I guess I'm trying to think of a better way to put this. How dirty does it get inside sometimes, man? Because there's obviously chop blocks that are happening. There's guys taking out your knees. You have to really read and react and be able to play off of contact a ton. How much of a physical game does this become against a Navy team?
Oh, it's absolutely a physical game. And like you said, like so much of that stuff, because, they go low with a lot of those cut blocks and stuff is just those legs, you got to callous them, right? At the end of the day, if you're not used to taking shots to the thigh boards over and over, right? But at the end of the day, like what do you teach as a linebacker? Well, you can't let them get to those thigh boards, right? Like how do you defeat cut blocks? So obviously the emphasis this week for Notre Dame is like, how can I defeat cuts? But also when you're defeating those cuts, have eyes in the backfield so that eventually, like I said, you can fit on the ball. So it's a unique perspective. How can I see the ball, follow it, track it the whole way, but also have peripheral vision to all these blocks? But like you said, it's a dirty game inside now. And at the end of the day, what will they do? If they can run that fullback for 4 yards every single play, they will bleed you out. And so really, like I said, inside out, right? That means that you got to stop that fullback dive, right? Like if there's nowhere to go with that and then it gets on the perimeter, I just feel like, especially in Notre Dame's scenario, they have better athletes, more athletic guys on the outside. So if you get it outside with guys that can run and get it to our speed players, then we're in a good situation. Where it really becomes difficult is if they're getting that 3 to 4 yards every single play with that fullback dive, because now, they're just going to keep doing it over and over. And then you think about it too, Navy's a 4th down team. So you got to play for 4 downs as opposed to 3. And so you think about it right there, it's already a first down, even if they're getting 3 yards, 2 yards, a fullback dive.
Well, we talked about that yesterday, Greer. It's like I feel like the worst thing for Navy is to have a negative play on first down, right? Like if they get into 2nd and 12s or 3rd and 9s, like that's not where they want to be. They want to be in front of the chains. Please excuse the cliche there. So I think that's a tremendous. I want to ask one more thing about just like the technical aspects.
Yeah.
Because the other big plays that we see sometimes is Navy lulls you to sleep, right? They lull you to sleep, and then they maybe just hit a little pass over top, a little bit of play action or waggle, whatever it ends up being. How important is the trust factor as a defensive player against Navy? Trusting that my safeties aren't going to get sucked up too often, my corners are going to play off of blocks, my defensive linemen are obviously going to be in the right gap consistently, anchoring and doing all those types of things. How important is the communication and the trust aspect of playing against a team like this?
Oh, it's huge, right? Because like all the coaches saying is cliche is like do your 1/11th, right? at the end of the day, this is the highlighted game where that's the most important, right? Because you got to trust what the guys are doing outside you, inside of you, right? Because at the end of the day, you have a responsibility. But I would also say that, like you said, right, they lull you to sleep. It's almost very similar to a heavy run team that then takes a play action shot, It's the same exact thing. They run it 5 or 6 times, then they 7-man pro it, right, and take shots down the field. It's very similar in that aspect. And so to me, it's also like understanding demeanor. Hey, how is this guy releasing off of a run play versus a pass play? Is there any tendency that we can pick up there? And for me, it was always when I was watching that tape before that game was, hey, those wing players, those, overhangs, like what are their releases? How is their demeanor different? Are they a little bit wider when they run a route as opposed to a run play? So just trying to pick up on some of those things. Obviously, I'm not in the game plan this week per se with Notre Dame, but I would say that those are some of those things that you can pick up, that you can have clean eyes as we talk about it.
So the game planning, I think, is super interesting. Typically, or at least it has been over the last few years, Navy's usually tucked at like the back end of the schedule. So it's very unique in the aspect of coaches are going to kind of just pull that out occasionally, right? Like maybe a session that will, work on the triple option, the eyes and the fits and all that type of stuff. How did you guys manage when you played as far as balancing the everyday of fall camp into the season of preparation, but also keeping in the back of your mind, like we need to at times have attention to stop at the triple option because it is something that we're going to see at some point this season?
Yeah, and I think it's just because it's such a unique deal, right? Like you said, right? Like you play UNC, you play NC State, you play these schools that are very similar, right? Like most offenses kind of are copycat offenses, right? But this is so much different in the fact that, you have to make time for it in fall camp. So for instance, Charlotte plays Navy this year. And so what did we do during fall camp? Well, we had, a 10-minute period every 5 or 6 days where we just introduced, hey, this is the blocking schemes. These are our keys. This is our assignments, right? Just so that, hey, when we introduce it towards the later half of the season, I think we maybe play them game 6 or something like that, that's not the first time we're introducing it. So I think it's almost an advantage that Notre Dame plays in week 1, just because now they've had multiple weeks of prep for this, right? Because of the uniqueness of the deal. And then once they get through this game, now they can start getting in traditional defensive scheme and start planning that way.
And that was my last question about the Navy layer before we get into, kind of what you've been up to. But do you, as a player, do you feel like you would have preferred Navy to be the first game of the year and then move on, or do you like it tucked in the back? We've had like a back and forth about this. I personally think that it's cool to just kind of get it out of the way. That's just kind of my personal perspective. But I would love to hear if does that matter to you? Would you like to have just gotten out of the way, like as far as scheduling that game?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that one from is a different perspective between coach and a player, right? So your biggest worry as a coach is, do we get out of that game healthy?
Sure.
It's week 0. Can I get all my dudes out of that game, ready to roll for the rest of the season? So that would be one concern. But I think that as a player, selfishly, because I knew it was going to be a big game for me. Like, for instance, my last game at Notre Dame was against Navy. And ended up getting the game ball, had a bunch of tackles, all that stuff. So that's an incredibly special moment for me. So it's hard to say just because of that kind of perspective to it, because that kind of was the cherry on the top to my career. But I do think that playing them early for a player would be a good mindset, because then I focus all my attention on Navy, right? Let's get through the triple option, all this stuff. And then once that's out of the way, now I can focus on, hey, this is traditional defense. This is how we got to rock. And then you kind of get a little bit of a flow going throughout the season.